I should have known something was wrong when they offered me 3 times my university salary. But desperation has a way of making red flags look like welcome mats, and I was desperate. My father's medical bills were piling up. My funding had been cut, and my department head had started leaving printouts of alternative career opportunities on my desk. So when the email appeared in my inbox, subject line, immediate opening, marine biologist, deep sea research, I didn't ask enough questions. I should have asked more questions. The submarine lurched as it detached from the surface vessel, and my stomach dropped with it. I pressed my forehead against the porthole, watching the last threads of sunlight fracture and die in the water above. Green faded to blue, blue to indigo, indigo to a shade of darkness that didn't have a name. My breath fogged the glass, and when I wiped it away, I caught my reflection staring back at me. I looked terrified. I was terrified. But it was too late to back out now. The descent to Station Nereus would take 40 minutes, the pilot had said. 40 minutes to drop 3 miles beneath the Pacific Ocean, to a place where the pressure could compress a human body into something the size of a basketball. I'd spent the last 2 weeks trying not to think about that. Now, strapped into my seat, with nothing but a few inches of reinforced hull between me and the crushing deep. It was all I could think about. I shared the submarine with 2 other passengers. Across from me sat a technician who hadn't looked up from his tablet since we'd left the surface. His thumb moved in the same pattern over and over. Scroll, pause, scroll. But his eyes weren't tracking the screen. They were unfocused, distant, like he was watching something else entirely. Something only he could see. Next to him sat a woman in a crisp corporate suit. She'd introduced herself as Ms. Reeves from administration, then immediately closed her eyes and hadn't opened them since. But I could see her fingers drumming against her thigh in sequences of 4. Tap, 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 tap. Pause. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythm never varied. Neither of them had spoken in 20 minutes. The silence felt deliberate, enforced, like there were rules down here that I hadn't learned yet. I pulled out the contract for what must have been the 12th time. The paper had gone soft from constant handling, and my fingerprints were visible as oil smudges on certain clauses. Section 7, Clause 3 still made my chest tight every time I read it. Employee acknowledges that certain research protocols may require psychological adjustment period. Employer is not liable for stress-related conditions arising from standard operational exposure. Standard operational exposure to what? I'd asked during my phone interview. The recruiter had laughed, a strange, brittle sound that didn't match the professional tone of the rest of our conversation, and mentioned something vague about isolation and pressure. The usual challenges of deep-sea work, he'd said. Then he'd repeated the salary figure, and I'd stopped asking questions. That laugh, though, it had sounded like a warning I was too stupid to understand. The submarine tilted forward, increasing its descent angle. My stomach lurched again, and I tasted bile at the back of my throat. Through the porthole, something bioluminescent drifted past, a cluster of blue-white lights that pulsed twice in quick succession, then went dark. I watched the empty water where it had been, waiting for it to light up again. It didn't. A new sound joined the constant groan of the hull, a rhythmic clicking from somewhere behind the walls. I counted without meaning to. 17 clicks, then silence, then 17 again. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision, but there was something organic about the sound, something that reminded me of insect mandibles or bird beaks striking metal. The technician whispered something. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent ice down my spine. It sounded like a prayer or a warning. I leaned forward slightly, trying to catch his eye, trying to signal that I was here, that we could talk, that the silence was worse than whatever small talk we might exchange. He looked up, and I saw that his pupils were dilated to the point where his eyes looked black. There was a small muscle twitching under his left eye, firing with the same regularity as the clicking in the walls. His mouth moved. "First time down," I think he said, though no sound came out. I nodded. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker across his face. Pity, maybe, or regret. Then his gaze dropped back to his tablet, and his thumb resumed its endless pattern. Scroll, pause, scroll. The woman, Ms. Reeves, opened her eyes. She looked directly at me, and her expression was pleasant, almost friendly. Somehow that made it worse. Her lips moved, forming words I could barely hear over the submarine's groaning. "We don't do small talk down here. You'll understand soon enough." Then her eyes closed again, and her fingers continued their pattern. Tap, 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 tap. I wanted to ask what she meant. I wanted to demand explanations, to insist on answers to the questions I should have asked before signing 73 pages of NDAs and liability waivers. But something in the way she'd said, "soon enough," made my throat close up, made my questions die before they could form into words. Instead, I sat on my hands to hide the trembling and stared out the porthole at nothing. The darkness outside was absolute now. No bioluminescence, no distant lights, nothing but black pressing against the glass. But every so often I caught movement. Not light, just displacement. The sense of something large passing close enough to disturb the water, to create currents that rocked the submarine gently in its wake. Whatever was out there, it was big. Bigger than a whale. Bigger than anything I'd studied in my decade of marine biology research. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A phantom vibration, since there was no service 3 miles down. But I pulled it out anyway, desperate for any connection to the surface world, to normalcy, to a reality where things made sense. The last message I'd received during our final sync was from my father's nurse. Next month's schedule. The costs outlined in neat, devastating rows. The total at the bottom that made 6 months in the deep seemed not just reasonable, but necessary. I put the phone away and tried not to calculate how many days I'd have to survive down here to make his last year comfortable instead of just managed. The math made me want to vomit. The submarine jerked sideways without warning. My head slammed against the porthole frame, and I saw stars explode across my vision. When my sight cleared, the technician was bracing himself against both walls, and Ms. Reeves had her eyes open and locked on something behind me. Something I couldn't see. The intercom crackled to life. I waited for the pilot's voice, for an explanation of the turbulence, for reassurance that everything was normal and under control. Instead, there was only static. But if I listened at the right angle, tilted my head just slightly to the left, the static almost sounded like words, like something trying to form language out of white noise and failing. The pitch changed 3 times, rising, falling, rising again, and then cut out completely. Ms. Reeves spoke into the silence. Normal. The pressure affects the electronics. It affects everything down here. The way she emphasized everything made me press harder against my seat, made me wish I could melt into the cushions and disappear. Lights appeared in the darkness ahead. Not the warm yellow of the submarine's running lights, but harsh white spots that seemed to absorb the black water rather than illuminate it. Station Nereus materialized in fragments. A curved wall here, a cluster of portholes there, sections connected by corridors that bent at angles my engineering professors would have called impossible. The schematics I'd studied had shown a neat, symmetrical structure, 8 modules arranged in a perfect ring around a central hub. What I was seeing now looked nothing like those plans. The modules were arranged wrong, connected at strange angles, and some sections appeared to be tilted or rotated in ways that shouldn't have been structurally sound. One of the white exterior lights flickered. In that moment of darkness, something passed in front of it. I caught an impression of size, massive size, and of limbs arranged in a configuration that made my brain hurt to process. Too many joints bending in too many directions. Then the light came back on, and there was only empty water. But the water was moving, churning, like something had just passed through it at high speed. I looked at the technician. He was staring at his tablet screen with an expression of such profound, bone-deep resignation that I felt cold spread from my chest to my extremities. The reflection in the porthole glass behind him showed what he was watching. Video footage of the station exterior. In the video, something was attached to one of the outer modules. Something with a body plan that my eyes couldn't quite follow, that seemed to have different numbers of limbs depending on which angle I looked from. The timestamp on the video read 3 days ago. He noticed me watching and turned the tablet face down on his lap. His hands were shaking so badly that he nearly dropped it. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but in the submarine's cramped interior, I heard every word. 6 months. The contract is 6 months. I nodded, not understanding why he was stating the obvious. I've been here for 5 months and 23 days. Oh God. The docking procedure began with sounds that I can still hear when I close my eyes. Metal scraping against metal in rhythms that were too regular to be random, but too irregular to be mechanical. Like teeth closing, like a mouth preparing to swallow. The submarine shuddered as it connected to the station's airlock. I felt the vibration through my seat, through my bones, through the soft tissue of my organs. Everything inside me was shaking, and I couldn't tell if it was from the docking procedure or from pure, primal fear. Ms. Reeves stood and brushed invisible lint from her suit. She smiled at me, a perfect corporate smile that belonged in conference rooms and orientation videos, not 3 miles underwater in a place that looked nothing like its schematics. She spoke, and her words had the practiced cadence of a speech she'd given many times before. Welcome to Station Nereus. Please remember that all initial reactions are confidential and covered under your NDA. Initial reactions. Like she expected me to have reactions that would need to be kept secret. Like everyone who came down here had reactions that required legal protection to contain. The pilot emerged from the cockpit for the first time since we'd left the surface. He had a scar running from his left ear down to his collar, and he moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to make unnecessary movements. His hands worked the airlock controls with practiced efficiency, and I noticed his nails, bitten down past the quick. Small scars around the cuticles where he'd been picking at the skin. According to the briefing materials, he'd been making this run for 3 years. 3 years of descending into the dark and returning to the light. I wondered what that did to a person's mind, what it was doing to mine right now. The airlock door opened and cold air rushed in. With it came a smell that bypassed my conscious mind and went straight to my hindbrain, to the part of me that still knew how to recognize danger. Not sulfur, not decay. Something worse. Something organic that had been kept in darkness and pressure for too long, until it had changed into something that nature never intended. Ms. Reeves stepped through the airlock first. The technician followed, moving like a man walking to his execution. I picked up my bag and stood, legs unsteady beneath me. Behind me, the pilot spoke. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it often, like he'd learned that silence was safer. The sub returns in 6 months. I know, I said, not turning around. It was in the contract. No. His voice was urgent now, insistent. I mean, it only returns if they call it back. If they don't call, it doesn't come. You should know that. I turned to look at him. He was staring at the controls, white-knuckled grip on the valve wheel, refusing to meet my eyes. Why wouldn't they call it back? He didn't answer. The airlock door began to close. I stepped through. The station's corridors were narrower than the schematics had indicated, and the walls wept condensation in constant streams. The water collected in channels along the floor, flowing in directions that didn't match the station's tilt. The lighting was red, emergency spectrum, I assumed, which turned the water droplets black as they fell. It looked like the walls were bleeding. Our footsteps echoed wrong. I'd walked enough institutional hallways in my career to know how footsteps should sound, how the rhythm should match the space and the pace. These echoes came back with extra beats, phantom steps that followed half a second behind our own, like we were being shadowed by something that matched our stride, but couldn't quite synchronize its timing. I tried to tell myself it was just acoustics, just the unusual shape of the corridors playing tricks with sound waves. But the rational part of my brain was getting quieter with every step deeper into the station. We passed a porthole, and I made the mistake of glancing out. Something was pressed against the glass from the outside. Not looking in, it didn't have eyes that I could identify, but resting there. Its surface rippled slowly, like skin over moving muscle, and I could see the impression of the glass pressing into whatever it was made of, creating a dimple, a mark. It knew the glass was there. It was testing it. Ms. Reeves didn't slow down. Neither did the technician. I kept walking, but I felt that things' attention follow me as I passed. Felt it the way you feel a stranger's stare on the back of your neck. A door to our left stood slightly ajar. As we walked by, I heard breathing from inside. Multiple sources, out of sync with each other. And underneath the breathing, a wet sound. Like someone chewing with their mouth open. Like something eating something else that was still alive enough to make small sounds of protest. The door swung closed as we passed. I heard the lock engage with a heavy click. I wanted to ask what was in that room. I wanted to demand explanations. But Ms. Reeves kept walking in her clicking heels, and the technician kept staring straight ahead, and I realized that asking questions would mark me as new, as ignorant, as prey. So I kept my mouth shut and followed. We turned a corner, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that I gasped. 15 degrees in the span of 3 steps. My breath misted in front of my face, and I watched it hang in the air for a moment too long before dissipating. The mist formed shapes as it dispersed, almost like letters, almost like words. Between the clicks of Ms. Reeves's heels, I heard something else. A voice, maybe, or the memory of a voice, singing in a language that sounded older than language should be. The melody was wrong, intervals that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce, harmonies that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. My cabin was exactly as the schematics had shown. Bed, desk, locker, window. The window had a shade, currently raised, showing the dark water beyond the hull. As I stood in the doorway, something long and pale drifted past outside. It moved against the current, propelling itself with purpose. It had too many segments. Ms. Reeves handed me a tablet. Her smile hadn't wavered once since we'd left the submarine. Orientation materials are loaded. Your shift begins at 800. Dr. Yates will meet you in section 7. She paused at the door, and her smile finally changed. Widened. Showed too many teeth. One more thing. The station makes sounds. Ignore them. The water outside makes sounds. Ignore those too. And if you hear knocking on your door after 2,200 hours, check the peephole first. Always check the peephole. Then she was gone, heels clicking away down the corridor, the sound fading but never quite disappearing completely. I stood in the center of my new room and listened, really listened. The station was breathing. I know how that sounds. I know what you're thinking. But I'm telling you, the ventilation system was inhaling and exhaling with a rhythm that was too slow, too measured to be mechanical. And the pipes were making wet sounds like something was moving through them. Something that wasn't water. I sat on the bed. The mattress was wrapped in plastic and it crinkled loudly under my weight. When was the last time someone had slept here? When was the last time someone had made it through their full contract? When was the last time someone had left this station alive? The tablet chimed. I picked it up, expecting the orientation materials Ms. Reeves had mentioned. Instead, there was a message. Sender, unknown. Timestamp, 23:47. I checked my watch. It was 23:44. The message was from 3 minutes in the future. I opened it with shaking hands. 3 words. Don't trust Yates. I deleted it immediately. The tablet chimed again. Same sender. Same impossible timestamp. Don't trust Reeves. Delete. Chime. Don't trust anyone who smiles. Delete. Chime. Don't trust anything that looks human. Delete. Chime. Don't trust the water. I deleted the message and turned the tablet face down on the desk. It chimed 6 more times in rapid succession before going silent. Outside my window, something scraped against the hull. 3 long scratches, deliberate and slow, then 2 short ones, then 3 long again. It was Morse code. SOS. But the sound was coming from outside the station, from something in the water, from something that knew human distress signals and was using them to communicate, or to lure. I pulled the shade down with trembling hands. In the gap before it closed completely, I saw light in the water, not bioluminescence. This was the wrong color, too red, too steady, and it was arranged in a pattern that I recognized from my research. A circle with radiating lines, like an eye, like something large enough to have eyes the size of portholes, looking directly at me. The shade clicked into place. I turned off the lights and lay on the plastic-wrapped mattress in the dark. The station breathed around me. The thing outside continued its SOS pattern, scratching it into the hull with something hard enough to score metal. 6 months. The contract was for 6 months. That technician had survived 5 months and 23 days. 7 days left on his contract. 7 days until the submarine was supposed to return. Supposed to, if they call it back. Somewhere deeper in the station, someone screamed. The sound cut off abruptly, replaced by rushing water and that wet chewing sound, closer now than it had been before, moving through the corridors, searching. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what sunlight felt like on my skin. Tried to remember the color of the sky. Tried to remember my father's face. I couldn't. I'd been down here for less than an hour, and already I was forgetting. The scratching outside my window changed rhythm. No longer SOS. Now it was spelling something else. Letter by letter, scraped into the hull with patient precision. Welcome home. I pulled my pillow over my head and waited for 0800. when I would meet Dr. Yates in Section 7 and learn what kind of research required a 73-page NDA and warnings about things that look human. The scratching continued all night. By morning, I'd stopped trying to convince myself it was just the current. By morning, I'd started wondering if I'd ever see the sun again. By morning, I understood why nobody on the submarine had wanted to talk. Some things, once you know them, can't be unknown. And I was about to learn all of them. I didn't sleep. I'm not sure anyone really sleeps down here. At 600, I gave up pretending. The scratching outside my window had stopped around 400, replaced by a silence that felt expectant, waiting. I lay on the plastic-wrapped mattress and counted the water droplets running down my wall, lost count at 437 when the drops started moving upward instead of down. I watched them crawl up the metal surface for 3 minutes before I convinced myself I was seeing things. Exhaustion, stress, normal reactions to abnormal circumstances. The drops continued their upward journey until they reached the ceiling and disappeared into a ventilation grate I hadn't noticed before. The shower barely worked. When I finally coaxed lukewarm water from the fixture, it smelled like standing tide pools and copper. I washed quickly, eyes closed against the spray, and when I opened them, the drain was gurgling. Not the normal sound of water going down. This was something else. Something that sounded almost like words forming in the pipes below. I turned off the water. The gurgling continued for another 30 seconds before stopping abruptly. The mirror had fogged over. As I reached for a towel, I noticed marks in the condensation. Not random patterns, letters, formed by something on the other side of the glass, where there should only be wall. Section 7. I wiped the mirror clean with my palm, leaving streaks. My reflection looked wrong in the red-tinged lighting. Older. My eyes had developed dark hollows overnight, and my skin had taken on a greyish cast that made me look like I'd been down here for months instead of hours. I looked like that technician from the submarine, the one with 7 days left on his contract. I wondered what he'd looked like on his first day. The tablet chimed at 7:30. A message from a sender listed only as a string of numbers. The text was brief, almost curt. Section 7. Specimen containment. Don't be late. No signature, no greeting. Just instructions delivered with the certainty that I would follow them. The corridors had changed overnight. The red emergency lighting had shifted to a dim white, but it wasn't an improvement. Now I could see the condensation on the walls more clearly, see how it formed patterns as it ran down the metal, patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like diagrams or maps of something I didn't want to understand. The water on the floor had increased. It flowed in those same channels, moving in directions that ignored gravity. I watched it run uphill for several feet before disappearing into vents near the ceiling. I passed 4 people on my way to Section 7. The first was a maintenance worker carrying a toolbox so covered in rust that I couldn't tell what color it had originally been. The metal was pitted and corroded in a way that should have taken years, not the few months this station had been operational. He walked past without acknowledging my existence, lips moving in sequences I recognized from my grandmother's rosary prayers. But the rhythm was wrong, too many repetitions, like he'd forgotten where the prayer ended and just kept looping the same phrases. The second was a young woman in a lab coat. She couldn't have been more than 25, with blonde hair pulled back so tightly I could see the tension in her scalp. When she saw me, her step faltered. Her eyes went wide, not with surprise, but with something closer to recognition or pity. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something. Her lips formed words, but no sound came out. Then she smiled, and the expression was so forced, so artificial, that it looked like her face was breaking. She hurried past, and as she went by, I heard her whisper something that sounded like an apology. An apology for what was going to happen to me, for what I was about to learn. The third person I passed was standing in an intersection of corridors, facing the corner where two walls met, just standing there, perfectly still, close enough that their forehead nearly touched the metal. They wore a standard station jumpsuit, but something about their proportions made my eyes slide away. Arms that hung too low, shoulders that didn't quite align with where shoulders should be. I gave them a wide berth and kept walking. As I passed, I heard their breathing, slow, measured, and underneath it, a sound like joints creaking, like something adjusting itself inside skin that didn't quite fit. I didn't look back. The fourth person was sitting on the floor outside a door marked medical. They had their knees pulled up to their chest and were rocking slowly, back and forth, back and forth. Their hands were pressed over their ears and they were humming. The same 4 notes over and over in a melody that made my teeth ache. As I passed, they stopped humming abruptly and looked up at me. Their eyes were bloodshot and there were scratches on their face, fresh ones, self-inflicted from the look of the nail marks. They spoke about hearing singing, about how it never stopped, even in silence, about how it had gotten inside their head and wouldn't leave. Their voice was hoarse, desperate, begging me to confirm that I could hear it too. I kept walking. Behind me, the humming resumed. Section 7 was at the far end of the station, past corridors I hadn't seen yet, and through a pressurized door that required palm authorization I shouldn't have had. But when I placed my hand on the scanner, it turned green immediately. The system had been expecting me. Beyond the door, the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the span of a single step. My breath misted, and I watched it hang in the air, longer than it should, before dissipating into shapes that looked almost intentional. The corridor here was different, wider. The walls were thicker. I could tell by the way sound died completely when I stepped through. No echo, no ambient noise, just my breathing and my footsteps, and even those sounded muffled and distant. Doors lined both sides, each marked with a number and a symbol I'd never seen in any scientific context. Not biohazard, not radiation, something older. The symbol looked like it had been designed to communicate danger across language barriers, across species barriers. A warning that would be understood by anything with eyes to see it. Dr. Yates was waiting outside door 7C. He was older than I'd expected from his brief bio in the orientation materials. Late 60s, possibly older, with white hair and wire-rimmed glasses that reflected the overhead lights in ways that made it impossible to see his eyes clearly. He stood with perfect posture, hands clasped behind his back, and didn't react at all when I approached. For a moment, I wondered if he was actually alive, or if he was like that person standing in the corner. Something that looked human, but wasn't quite. Then he blinked, and the illusion broke. His greeting was brief and precise. "Time matters down here more than I realized," he said. More than anyone realized until they'd been here long enough to understand. He turned and began walking deeper into Section 7 without waiting for acknowledgement. I followed, watching the way his shadow moved on the walls. It stayed properly aligned with his body. That was good. That was normal. I was already looking for signs of normal. Already treating humanity as something that needed to be verified. The briefing happened while walking. Dr. Yates spoke in a tone that suggested he'd given this speech many times. To many people, most of whom probably weren't around anymore. Station Nereus wasn't what the orientation materials described. The research into extremophile organisms and bioluminescence was real, but secondary, tertiary, really. The station existed because certain things lived at depth that couldn't be allowed to exist at the surface. Things that violated fundamental rules about how life should work. The ocean was older than humanity, deeper than we'd explored. And in those depths, things had evolved, or emerged, or always existed, that didn't follow the established laws of biology and physics. He stopped in front of door 7A and placed his palm on the scanner. His hand was completely steady, no tremor, no hesitation. The lock disengaged with a sound like bones breaking. Specimen A had been recovered in 1987 from a depth of 21,000 feet, found inside a pressurized container that predated human civilization by approximately 12,000 years. A container made from materials that didn't match any known metallurgy, covered in symbols that looked like warnings in a language no one could read. The door opened onto a small observation room. One wall was dominated by a window looking into a chamber beyond. Dr. Yates gestured for me to approach, but didn't move closer himself, like he'd learned through hard experience to maintain distance. I stepped up to the window. The chamber was filled with liquid, but calling it water would be inaccurate. The substance was too thick, too viscous. It moved in ways that ignored fluid dynamics, forming patterns and geometries that dissolved before my brain could fully process them. Watching it was like trying to see something in peripheral vision. The harder I focused, the less sense it made. Suspended in the center of this impossible liquid was something that hurt to perceive. It wasn't large, roughly spherical, about the size of a basketball, but its surface existed in dimensions my eyes weren't equipped to process, angles that folded into themselves and emerged somewhere else, curves that extended in directions that weren't spatial, colors I'd never seen before and forgot the moment I looked away. I felt my eyes starting to water. A headache was building behind my right eye, sharp and insistent. Dr. Yates warned me not to look directly at it for more than 30 seconds. The human brain wasn't designed to process its geometry. Extended observation led to seizures, to permanent cognitive damage, to seeing angles and dimensions that didn't exist even after looking away. I looked away, blinking hard. When I glanced back, the thing had changed position. Or maybe it hadn't moved at all, and my perception had shifted. There was no way to tell. I asked what it was. Dr. Yates's answer was simple and terrifying. We don't know. 36 years of study, and they had no idea what it was, where it came from, or what it wanted. If it wanted anything, it existed. That was all they could confirm with certainty. But it was contained. For now. Every 17 days, it did something. A pulse. They measured it through the walls, through the station structure, through the water outside. A rhythmic emanation of energy they couldn't classify using any known physics. When it pulsed, other things responded. The other specimens. And things in the deep that hadn't been contained yet. Things that heard the pulse and came closer to the station, circling in the dark just beyond camera range. He moved to the next door without elaborating. 7B. This time, when he placed his hand on the scanner, I noticed something. A slight tremor. Just for a moment. Then it was gone, controlled through what must have been years of practice. Specimen B had been recovered in 1993 from inside a sealed research vessel. The ship had been missing for 2 years. When the recovery team found it, everything was intact. No hull breaches, no signs of forced entry. The hatches were all sealed from the inside. But the entire crew was dead, and this specimen was in the main laboratory. The door opened. The chamber beyond was dry and lit by soft blue light. Floating in the air, not suspended by wires, but actually floating, was something that resembled a jellyfish, translucent, delicate, beautiful even. Its bell pulsed slowly, and long tentacles drifted beneath it in currents that didn't exist. Then I noticed the corners of the chamber. 7 people, or what used to be 7 people, desiccated, mummified, arranged in poses that suggested careful placement rather than collapse. Each corpse was missing its eyes, and from the empty sockets grew something that looked like hair. Thin filaments, hundreds of them, extending from the skull and spreading across the floor toward the center of the room. As I watched, the jellyfish drifted past one of the bodies. The filaments stirred, reaching upward like plants towards sunlight, straining, yearning. Dr. Yates explained in his clinical tone. The specimen fed on observation. The act of being watched sustained it, helped it grow. The more attention it received, the larger it became. Those bodies were the original research team. They'd watched it for 6 weeks straight before anyone understood what was happening. By then, it had grown into their minds, replaced their thoughts with the overwhelming need to observe. They stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped doing anything except watching the specimen drift through its chamber. Just watched until their bodies gave out and they died of dehydration and exhaustion. The filaments were still connected to it. Even in death, they were still watching through empty eyes, still feeding it their attention across the boundary between life and whatever came after. I stepped back from the window. My legs felt weak. Dr. Yates mentioned they'd tried to destroy it. Fire, acid, pressure, vacuum, extreme cold, extreme heat. Nothing affected it. The specimen remained unchanged, untouched. The bodies could be destroyed. They'd tried that too. Incinerated the corpses, reduced them to ash. But new ones appeared within 48 hours. 7 bodies. Always 7. They didn't bring them in. The bodies simply manifested in the chamber, already desiccated, already missing their eyes, already growing filaments. The specimen needed 7 observers. When it didn't have them, it created them. He closed the door. The lock engaged with that same bone-breaking sound. His explanation of my responsibilities was methodical and precise. Monitoring, observation, recording. I would observe each specimen twice daily, no more than 5 minutes per observation. Would record any changes in behavior, appearance, or containment integrity. Would not enter any chamber under any circumstances. Would not make physical contact with any specimen. Would not exceed observation time limits. The rules were absolute, non-negotiable, written in the blood of researchers who'd broken them. We walked to door 7C. This one had additional security, a keypad, a retinal scanner, a warning placard that simply read, "Cognitive hazard, limit exposure." Dr. Yates entered a code with practiced efficiency, pressed his eye against the scanner. The door unlocked with multiple mechanical sounds, layers of security disengaging one by one. Each lock sounded deliberate, necessary, like someone had learned through terrible experience exactly how much security this specimen required. Specimen C required special protocols, he explained. The observation window was shuttered. When I opened the shutter, I would have 30 seconds. Not 31, not 29. Exactly 30. A timer would count down. When it reached 0, I was to close my eyes and step back immediately. I was not to look at the specimen beyond the time limit under any circumstances. I was not to close my eyes before the timer expired. Specimen C responded to closed eyes. He didn't explain how, didn't need to. His expression told me everything I needed to know about what happened to people who closed their eyes at the wrong time. He pressed a button labeled Open, 30-second limit. A timer appeared on a small screen, 0030. The metal shutter began to rise with a mechanical whir that sounded too loud in the confined space. The chamber beyond was massive, at least 50 feet on each side, filled with water that actually looked like water. Dozens of high-intensity lights illuminated every corner, leaving no shadows, no dark places. Every inch of space was visible, monitored, controlled. In the center of the chamber, suspended in the water, was a child, a girl, maybe 7 years old, long dark hair floating around her head like seaweed, white dress that moved in currents that didn't exist, arms at her sides, eyes closed, peaceful, like she was sleeping. 0027. She opened her eyes. They were wrong. Not black, that would have been almost normal. These were an absence. Voids where eyes should be. Spaces that light fell into and didn't escape. Looking at them created a pulling sensation in my chest, like they were trying to draw something out of me. Something essential. She smiled. Her mouth opened. Wider than any human mouth. Wider than physics should allow. The smile extended past her ears, splitting her face nearly in half. Inside, I saw teeth, rows upon rows, spiraling down into her throat, teeth all the way down to somewhere that shouldn't exist inside a small body. She began to move through the water, not swimming, not floating. She moved like the water itself was pulling her forward, or like she was pulling herself through space and the water was irrelevant. Her arms and legs remained perfectly still, positioned at her sides. Only her head moved, tilting to track my position with predatory precision. Getting closer to the window, closer. I wanted to step back, needed to step back, but my legs wouldn't respond. Those void eyes had me locked in place, and I could feel something reaching out from them, reaching into my mind, searching for something, searching for the part of me that would let it in. Her face was pressed against the glass now, that impossible smile distorting further. I could see down her throat, see the teeth spiraling into darkness, see something moving in that darkness, something that wasn't throat or stomach or any internal organ, something looking back at me. Music started, not from any speaker, from inside my head. A song I'd never heard, but somehow knew. A melody that made promises about deep water and peaceful sleep and the comfort of drowning. How easy it would be, how good it would feel, how much she wanted me to join her, how lonely she was in the water, how lonely I was up here. My hand was reaching for the door handle. I hadn't told it to move. It was moving on its own, responding to the song, responding to those eyes, responding to the promise of peace in the deep water, of never being alone again, of home. Dr. Yates grabbed my wrist, pulled my hand away from the door with strength that belied his age. He told me to close my eyes. The command was sharp, urgent. I closed them. The shutter slammed down with a bang that made me gasp. The song stopped immediately, cut off like someone had severed a wire. The silence that replaced it was almost painful. I was shaking. My whole body was shaking, and sweat was running down my face despite the cold. I could still feel where those eyes had been looking into me. Could still hear echoes of that song, promising peace and unity and an end to loneliness. Dr. Yates released my wrist and checked the timer with clinical detachment. 29 seconds. Acceptable. I made it to the corner before I vomited. Nothing came up but bile and acid. My stomach was empty. I'd been too anxious to eat. When I finished, Dr. Yates handed me a cloth without comment, waited while I cleaned my mouth. Didn't show any sign of judgment or concern, just patience. Like he'd stood here before, watching other researchers vomit after their first exposure to Specimen C. Like he knew I'd eventually get used to it. Like everyone did. I asked what it was, though I'm not sure I wanted the answer. Dr. Yates's explanation was delivered in the same clinical tone he'd used for everything else. Specimen C had been recovered in 2003 from the site of a maritime disaster, a cruise ship, 417 passengers and crew. Only one survivor, an engineer who'd been in a sealed engine compartment when it happened. When she sang to them, when they all walked into the ocean to be with her. 416 people, including 73 children, walked off the ship in orderly lines and drowned themselves in the Atlantic. The bodies were found 3 days later by a Coast Guard search team. They'd been holding hands in a chain that extended down 2,000 feet, far deeper than recreational divers should have been able to reach, far deeper than human lungs could withstand. All of them were smiling. All of them had the same expression of peaceful joy, like they'd finally found what they'd been searching for their entire lives. I leaned against the wall. The metal was cold against my back, grounding me in physical sensation, in reality, in the world where things made sense. Dr. Yates mentioned there were 14 more specimens. We wouldn't view them all today. I needed time to acclimate, time to build up psychological resistance to what I was seeing, like repeated exposure to nightmares could somehow make them normal. I said I didn't think I could do this. The words came out weak, pathetic. His response was matter of fact. Everyone said that, but I'd signed the contract. I'd read Section 7, Clause 3. I'd known there would be psychological adjustment required. I protested that I hadn't known it would be this, hadn't understood what psychological adjustment really meant. His answer was simple and absolute. No one ever does. Understanding comes from experience, not briefings, from seeing, not reading, from surviving, not preparing, and I would understand, eventually, if I survived long enough. He adjusted his glasses and led me to an unmarked door, nearly invisible against the wall. The room beyond was small, dominated by monitors arranged in a grid covering 3 walls. Dozens of screens, each showing a different chamber, different impossibilities contained behind steel and glass and hope. I could see Specimen A pulsing slowly in its thick liquid, Specimen B drifting while those corpses reached toward it with filament hair, and there, on one screen, Specimen C, swimming in circles, around and around, like she was waiting for something, for someone, for me. One chair, one desk, one tablet for recording observations. This would be my world for 6 months. Dr. Yates explained the shift schedule, 800 to 1600. Someone would relieve me. Usually, if no one came, I was to continue monitoring until someone did, no matter how long that took. I asked about the unusual qualifier. Usually, his answer was brief, understaffed. Retention was difficult. People didn't last long in this position. I asked what happened to the person I was replacing. He paused at the door. For the first time, his clinical detachment cracked slightly. I saw something flicker across his face. Not quite emotion. More like the memory of emotion. The ghost of something he'd felt before learning to stop feeling. He told me to check chamber 7M. The feed was on monitor 23. I'd find my answer there. Then he left, and I was alone with the screens and the things they showed. The chair was still warm when I sat down. Someone had been sitting here very recently indeed. I found monitor 23, chamber 7M. The feed showed an empty room. The containment door was open, standing wide open, which should have been impossible. Multiple locks, redundant security, fail-safes designed to prevent exactly this scenario. On the wall, written in something dark that had dripped and dried, were 2 words: helped me. The timestamp read 0647, less than 2 hours ago. I stared at those words, trying to understand. Helped who? Helped with what? Had the previous researcher helped the specimen escape? Had they opened the door deliberately? Or had the specimen written those words after consuming them? Then I noticed something else. Drag marks on the floor, leading from the chamber into the corridor. Something heavy had been pulled, or had crawled out on its own, leaving furrows in the metal. The feed flickered, just for a moment. When it stabilized, there was something new on the wall. Not words this time. A handprint. Fresh, still wet, still glistening in the chamber lights, with 7 fingers. I looked at the other monitors. All those specimens in their chambers. All those impossible things contained behind barriers that suddenly seemed far too thin. And somewhere in this station, something from 7M was loose, walking the corridors, learning how to be human, or learning how to hunt humans. I reached for the red emergency button on the desk, the one Dr. Yates had mentioned in passing, the one that would summon help, eventually. Before I could press it, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, slow, uneven, like someone learning how to walk, or something trying to remember how humans moved, how many steps between each foot placement, how much weight to shift, how to coordinate limbs that weren't originally designed for bipedal locomotion. The footsteps stopped outside my door. Silence, complete silence. I held my breath and stared at the door handle, watching it with the intensity of prey, watching a predator. It turned, slowly, testing the mechanism, trying to understand how it worked, how much pressure to apply, which direction to rotate. I kept my hand hovering over the red button, watching the handle rotate degree by degree, wondering if the door was locked, wondering if locks even mattered to something that could escape a chamber with multiple redundant security systems. The handle stopped turning, paused, like whatever was on the other side was reconsidering, reassessing. Then the footsteps resumed, moving away down the corridor, fading but not disappearing entirely, just growing more distant, searching for another door to try, another person to visit, another researcher to help. I sat back and looked at the monitors, at Specimen C swimming her circles, at the empty chamber 7M, at all these contained impossibilities that suddenly didn't seem very contained at all. And I understood why the contract had been 73 pages long, why the submarine only returned if called, why everyone down here looked like they were already dead inside, why no one had warned me about what this job actually entailed, because warnings wouldn't have mattered. I needed the money, needed this job, would have signed anyway, would have come down here anyway, would have sat in this warm chair anyway. Some traps you walk into with your eyes open because you have no other choice. I had 6 months to survive this. 6 months of monitoring things that shouldn't exist. 6 months of watching screens and recording observations and pretending this was somehow normal scientific research. 6 months of hoping that whatever was walking the corridors didn't find my door unlocked. The feed from 7M flickered again. When it cleared, more words had appeared on the wall below the handprint. Thank you for letting me out. My hands were shaking as I picked up the tablet to begin my first observation log. The screen was already open to a template. Previous entries were visible in the history. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Years of researchers sitting in this chair, watching these screens, recording observations. I scrolled through the most recent entries. They were written in different handwriting styles, different researchers rotating through this position. The entries grew more erratic over time, more desperate, more fragmented. The last entry was from yesterday, written by whoever had been sitting in this chair before me, before they'd gone to Chamber 7M and helped something escape. The entry was brief. I can't stop hearing it sing, even when I'm not in observation, even when the monitors are off. It's in my head. It knows my name. It knows where I sleep. It knows I'm alone down here. It knows I'm lonely. It says it can fix that. It says all I have to do is open the door. Below that, written in what looked like a different pen, added later, maybe just before they went to 7M. It's not lying. I put the tablet down and stared at the monitors, at all those specimens in their chambers, at all those things that sang and called and promised and lied. Or maybe they weren't lying. Maybe that was worse. In the corridor outside, something scraped against my door 3 times. Deliberate, rhythmic, like knocking, but wrong. Like something that had seen humans knock but didn't quite understand the purpose. Then it moved on, continuing its patrol, its search, its hunt. I looked at monitor 23 one more time. Chamber 7M, empty, door open. Those words on the wall promising gratitude for liberation. And I wondered how long I would last before I started hearing it sing, before I started believing its promises, before I went to one of these chambers and helped something else escape. My shift had just begun, and I was already losing. The first 3 days, I convinced myself I could handle this. I was wrong. The monitoring room became my entire world. 8 hours a day, sometimes 12 when my relief didn't show, watching screens that displayed nightmares in high definition. I learned the patterns. Specimen A pulsed every 17 days at exactly 0347. Specimen B drifted in the same figure-8 pattern, the corpses in the corners tracking its movement with their filament hair. Specimen C swam her endless circles, occasionally pressing her face against the glass and smiling at cameras that shouldn't have been able to see her from those angles. I learned not to look directly at certain monitors for too long, learned which specimens caused headaches, which ones caused nosebleeds, which ones made me forget my own name for several minutes after observation. I learned that the station made sounds that had nothing to do with mechanical systems or water pressure. And I learned that whatever had escaped from Chamber 7M was still loose. I saw it on the feeds sometimes, never clearly, just glimpses in corridors between camera coverage zones, a shadow that moved wrong, a shape that didn't align with human proportions. Once, on the feed from the residential section, I watched it stand outside someone's door for 40 minutes, perfectly still, before walking away. The next day, that person didn't show up for their shift. No one mentioned it. No one filed a report. Their nameplate was simply removed from the duty roster, and someone else took over their responsibilities. That's how things worked down here. People disappeared, and everyone pretended it was normal. On my 4th day, Dr. Yates scheduled a briefing in what he called the common area, a room that was anything but common. The space was too large for the station's layout, extending in directions that didn't match the schematics. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, thousands maybe, all showing the ocean's surface at different times of day, different weather conditions, sunlight on water, waves, clouds, reminders of a world that existed 3 miles above us. 7 people sat around a table that looked like it had been salvaged from a corporate conference room. The juxtaposition was surreal. Office furniture in a place where geometry didn't work right, and things that shouldn't exist were kept in chambers, with doors that sounded like breaking bones. Dr. Yates sat at the head of the table. To his right was a woman I recognized from the corridors, the one who'd whispered an apology to me on my first day. Dr. Amanda Reese, according to the nameplate in front of her. She looked worse now. Her hair was still pulled back tightly, but I could see bald patches where she'd been pulling it out. Her hands trembled constantly, and she kept glancing at the door like she expected something to walk through it. Next to her sat Dr. Marcus Webb, a man in his 50s with a thick beard and eyes that didn't quite focus on anything. He was humming under his breath, the same 4 notes I'd heard from the person sitting outside medical. The melody made my fillings ache and my vision blur at the edges. Across from them were 2 younger researchers. Dr. David Park had dark circles under his eyes, so pronounced they looked like bruises. Next to him sat Dr. Lisa Chen, no relation to me despite the shared surname, who was methodically peeling the skin from her cuticles, creating small bloody crescents around each fingernail. They sat close together, but didn't touch, didn't look at each other. Like proximity was all they could manage. At the far end of the table sat someone in a maintenance uniform. The nameplate read, Alex Crowley, Maintenance Supervisor. They wore a surgical mask, despite there being no apparent need for one, and their hands were completely wrapped in bandages. When they noticed me looking, they pulled their sleeves down to cover the bandages completely. The 7th person was standing in the corner, facing the wall. They wore a lab coat, but I couldn't see anything else about them. They stood perfectly still, and no one acknowledged their presence. Everyone seemed to be deliberately not looking at that corner. Dr. Yates began the briefing by pulling up images on the central display. Photographs of specimens I hadn't seen yet. Things that made the impossible geometry of Specimen A seem almost mundane by comparison. Dr. Reese's voice was thin and strained as she described Specimen 7D, recovered in 1997 from a Russian research vessel. The entire crew was dead, had been dead for approximately 6 months, but the bodies showed no signs of decomposition. They were all arranged in the mess hall, seated at tables, hands folded, like they were waiting for a meal that never came. The photograph showed bodies in naval uniforms, seated in neat rows. Their eyes were open. Their faces were grey. Something about the way they were positioned suggested they'd placed themselves there, had chosen those seats, had folded their own hands before whatever happened to them happened. When the recovery team moved the first body, they discovered why there'd been no decomposition. The corpses were hollow. Everything inside, organs, bones, blood, had been removed with surgical precision. The skin was intact, perfectly preserved, but the interior was completely empty, like someone had unzipped them and poured out their contents. What had been inside them was found in the ship's water tank. The next image made me wish I'd skipped breakfast. The water tank was filled with a mass of organic material. Flesh and bone and cartilage fused together into a single pulsing structure. It had somehow squeezed itself through pipes that shouldn't have accommodated anything larger than a fist, compressing and expanding, like it understood fluid dynamics better than physics said it should. The mass was now contained in chamber 7D, growing, slowly but steadily. currently occupying approximately 70% of the available space. Dr. Rees's notes estimated it would fill the entire chamber within 18 months. No one explained what would happen when it ran out of room. Dr. Webb spoke next, his humming pausing just long enough to form words before resuming its aching rhythm. Specimen 7H resembled a rock formation approximately 2 meters in height, composed of a mineral that didn't match anything in the known periodic table. Recovered from the Mariana Trench in 2001 during a deep-sea survey that had lost half its crew to what the official report called equipment malfunction. The specimen didn't move, didn't react to any stimuli, but every 48 hours it produced sound, subsonic frequencies that propagated through the station structure despite the chamber's acoustic insulation. The sound caused dreams, vivid, unavoidable, always the same. You're at the bottom of the ocean, and something is building a city down there in the dark, building it from materials that don't exist in our periodic table, building it with architecture that defies Euclidean geometry, building it for us, waiting for us to join it. Dr. Yates interjected that the chamber was now insulated, that I wouldn't hear the sound from the monitoring room. But Dr. Webb's humming suggested otherwise. The way his eyes didn't quite focus suggested he was seeing that city right now, even awake, even with the specimens sealed away. Everyone dreams about it eventually, his expression said. Even without hearing the sound, it gets into your head and stays there, showing you where you're supposed to go, where you're supposed to be. Dr. Park's voice was completely monotone as he described Specimen 7N, biological in nature. Recovered in 2005 from a depth of 18,000 feet, found in a pressurized container of unknown origin. It resembled a human fetus, approximately 7 months development, but with abnormalities he didn't elaborate on, didn't need to elaborate on. The photograph showed enough. Too many limbs. Eyes in places eyes shouldn't be. A skeletal structure that was almost human, but diverged in ways that suggested it was evolving towards something else. Something that would look human from a distance, but would be utterly wrong up close. It was alive. Brain activity, cardiac function, respiratory movement, all confirmed through non-invasive monitoring. But it hadn't aged, hadn't grown, hadn't changed at all in 18 years of observation, locked in a state of eternal development, waiting for something, for some signal or trigger that would tell it to continue growing. Dr. Park started to mention failed experiments, but Dr. Yates cut him off with a look. Some things weren't part of the briefing. Some things were locked in sealed files and sealed memories. The person in the corner shifted slightly. Everyone at the table tensed, stopped talking, stopped moving, like prey animals freezing when a predator stirs. After a moment, the person returned to perfect stillness, and the briefing continued. Dr. Yates described Specimen 7Q in terms that made my head hurt. Temporal in nature, difficult to explain, impossible to perceive properly. The chamber existed in multiple time frames simultaneously. When you observed it, you saw it as it was, as it is, and as it will be, all occupying the same space at the same time. What was inside the chamber was unclear. The temporal distortion made direct observation impossible. But whatever it was aware of observers. When you looked at 7Q, you felt it looking back, across time. It had already seen you looking at it in its past, was currently watching you in its present, would remember you looking at it in its future, all simultaneously, all with an intelligence that understood causality in ways human minds weren't designed to process. The detailed protocols for each specimen came later. Observation times carefully calculated to minimize psychological damage, warning signs to watch for, emergency procedures in case of containment breach or behavioral anomalies, or specimen death. I'd asked if they could die. The question hung in the air for too long before Dr. Yates answered. Some of them, maybe, theoretically. We've never actually witnessed it. But if it happened, protocol required immediate documentation, and the klaxon cut him off. Loud, piercing. The kind of alarm that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to primal panic. The kind that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. Everyone stood simultaneously. Even the person in the corner turned away from the wall. I could see their face now. I immediately wished I couldn't. It was covered in eyes. Dozens of them. Different sizes, different colors, different levels of development. Some fully formed, some just partially open slits in the skin, arranged in clusters across their face where features should be. All of them looking in different directions. None of them blinking in sync. Some not blinking at all. Dr. Yates was already moving toward the door, tablet in hand, face pale. He checked the screen and went even paler. His hands started shaking. The clinical detachment I'd seen in him since my arrival cracked completely. The others reacted to whatever he'd seen on that screen like he'd announced the end of the world. Dr. Webb's humming stopped completely. The first time I'd heard him go silent. Dr. Park grabbed his partner's hand with white-knuckled intensity. The first physical contact I'd seen between them. Containment breach. Section 7. Specimen 7F. I didn't know what 7F was. Hadn't been briefed on it yet. But the terror on everyone's faces told me everything I needed to know. We ran. The corridors seemed to stretch longer as we moved through them, like the station was expanding to delay our arrival. Doors were slamming shut automatically, sealing off sections with heavy mechanical sounds. The klaxon continued its piercing wail, and underneath it, I could hear something else. Screaming. Human voices in terminal distress. The observation center was chaos when we arrived. Dr. Yates immediately pulled up the chamber feeds, cycling through them with frantic speed. Chamber 7A, empty. The thick, impossible liquid was gone. The specimen that hurt to perceive was gone. Only empty space remained. Chamber 7B. The jellyfish that fed on observation was pressed against the ceiling, pulsing so rapidly it was almost vibrating. The corpses in the corners had all turned to face the door, their filament hair reaching toward it, like they could sense what was happening beyond the walls. Chamber 7C. Specimen. C had stopped her eternal swimming. She floated in the center of the chamber, perfectly still, head tilted at an angle that looked like listening, waiting. Her void eyes were fixed on something I couldn't see. Chambers 7D through 7E showed their specimens behaving normally, as normal as impossible things could behave. Chamber 7F showed only darkness. The lights were out, which shouldn't have been possible. Each chamber had redundant lighting systems, backups for the backups, independent power sources. But the screen showed only absolute black, not the black of a powered-down camera. This was deeper, more complete, the black of something that consumed light. Then something moved in that darkness. I could tell it was massive from the way it displaced the black, creating currents of deeper shadow within the void. It moved across the chamber, slowly, deliberately, and as it moved, the darkness seemed to spread beyond the chamber walls. I watched it seep under the door, like liquid, flow into the corridor like smoke, climb the walls, like something alive and hungry. Alex Crowley was already at a terminal, fingers flying across keys despite the bandages, seals engaging, pressure doors closing, Section 7 being locked down with every safety measure the station possessed. The darkness was in the corridors now. The feed from the hallway outside 7F showed shadows spreading across the floor, climbing the walls, pooling on the ceiling, growing, searching. Dr. Park's voice was sharp with panic. The door was still closed. The containment appeared intact. There was no visible breach point. Dr. Webb's humming resumed with a edge of hysteria. It doesn't need doors, his tone suggested. It is the darkness. Any shadow is a doorway for it. Any absence of light is a space it can occupy. On the monitors, I watched the dark spread through Section 7 with predatory intelligence. It moved like it was searching, like it was looking for something specific. Then I saw what it was hunting. On the feed from corridor 7C, someone was running. A maintenance worker in coveralls, sprinting toward the emergency bulkhead with the kind of speed that only absolute terror can produce. The dark was behind them, spreading faster now, reaching out with tendrils that stretched across ceiling and walls. The person didn't make it. The darkness caught them 3 feet from the bulkhead door. It wrapped around their legs first, then their torso, moving up their body like rising water, like a living thing swallowing prey. The person screamed. I could see their mouth open, see the terror and agony on their face. But no sound came through the feed, just silent screaming as the darkness consumed them. It covered their head. For a moment, they were completely engulfed, a human-shaped shadow struggling against the black, thrashing, fighting. Then the movements became slower, more deliberate. Then they stopped struggling entirely. The darkness receded, flowing back down the corridor towards 7F, like a tide returning to the sea. It left the person standing in the hallway, upright and still. But something was catastrophically wrong with them. They turned to face the camera with movements that were too smooth, too fluid. Human joints don't rotate that way. Human spines don't articulate with that range of motion. Their eyes were black, completely black. No whites, no iris, no pupil. Just void, like Specimen C's eyes, but somehow worse. These eyes weren't just empty. They were hungry. They were doorways to the same darkness that had consumed them. They smiled. The expression split their face in a way that looked painful, stretching skin past its normal limits. Then they started walking toward the bulkhead door with that same too fluid motion. Dr. Reese's whisper was barely audible. It's spreading. It's using hosts. It's not just darkness anymore. It's learning how to be us. Dr. Yates was already moving, heading for the bulkhead controls. Alex was there first, hand hovering over the emergency closure button, hesitating. There were still people in Section 7, living people who hadn't been consumed yet. Closing the bulkhead would trap them with the darkness. Dr. Yates reached past Alex and hit the control himself. On the monitors, I watched the massive bulkhead door begin to descend, 37 tons of reinforced steel moving with mechanical precision. The possessed maintenance worker was almost there, reaching for the gap, moving faster now, faster than human muscles should allow. The door came down. I looked away before it finished closing, before I could see what happened to the hands that were reaching through the gap. The klaxon stopped. In the sudden silence, everyone's breathing sounded too loud, too fast, panicked and shallow and barely controlled. Alex's voice was quiet and strained. Section 7 are sealed. 37-ton bulkhead. 3-foot thick steel. Nothing gets through that. I asked about the people still inside. The The people we'd just trapped with an entity that consumed light and wore human bodies like suits. Dr. Yates didn't look at me, just stared at the monitors, at the feeds showing Section 7 now cut off from the rest of the station. His expression was carved from stone and guilt. They knew the risks. It's in their contracts. Section 7, Clause 3. Containment takes priority over individual survival. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. On the monitors, I counted 5 people trapped on the other side of the bulkhead. 5 people in corridors where darkness spread like infection, where shadows had become predators, where something wore the bodies of the consumed. I asked how long they could survive in there. The question felt obscene, clinical, like I was already treating them as statistics instead of people. Dr. Yates' answer was worse than silence. It didn't matter how long they could survive. Section 7 would stay sealed for a minimum of 72 hours, until they could confirm containment, until they could be sure the darkness hadn't found a way through the bulkhead. 72 hours, 3 days. The people trapped inside would be dead long before then. From the darkness, from lack of air, from each other if the entity learned how to make them kill. Better 5 deaths than allowing 7F to reach the rest of the station. Dr. Yates's face showed he'd made this calculation before, had sealed sections before, had sacrificed people before. This is what we do here. We make terrible choices to prevent worse outcomes. You signed up for this when you signed those 73 pages. I watched the monitors, watched those 5 people trying to find safety in a section where safety had ceased to exist. One of them was Dr. Lisa Chen. She was pounding on the bulkhead door, screaming something I couldn't hear through the camera feed. Her fists left bloody marks on the steel. Dr. Park stood frozen, staring at the screen showing his partner. His hand was still extended, like he was reaching for her across the impossible distance. Like if he reached hard enough, he could pull her through solid steel. I said we had to let them out. The words came out desperate, pleading. I already knew the answer. Dr. Yates's response was immediate and final. We don't. We won't. Containment protocol is absolute. On the monitor showing chamber 7F, the darkness was receding, flowing back into the chamber like it had finished whatever it had set out to do. The lights flickered on, revealing an empty room. Clean walls, pristine floor. No sign of what had emerged. No evidence of the horror that had just consumed a human being. But in the corridor, the shadows were still moving, still searching, still spreading through Section 7 like a slow stain, and the 5 trapped people were running out of places to hide. Dr. Reese broke the silence with a question that made everything worse. 7A was also missing, had left its chamber, the specimen that existed in impossible dimensions, that pulsed every 17 days and called to things in the deep. Where had it gone? We checked every feed, cycled through every camera in Section 7. Specimen A was nowhere to be seen, just gone, vanished from a sealed chamber with no visible exit point. Dr. Webb's humming returned as he explained. It can pass through walls. The dimensional properties mean it doesn't experience space the way we do. Doesn't experience barriers or obstacles or the concept of inside and outside. It could be anywhere, in the walls, in the floor, in the space between spaces. Dr. Reese's addition made it worse. It could be here, in this room, right now, moving through dimensions we can't perceive, watching us from angles we can't see. Doctor. Yates shook his head with forced confidence. Section 7 was sealed. Nothing gets in or out. We're safe here. Dr. Webb's correction was gentle and terrifying. Nothing human gets in or out. But these aren't human. They don't follow our rules. Our walls might as well be suggestions to them. A new alarm started, different from the klaxon. This was a steady, rhythmic pulse that made my chest tighten with each beat, like the alarm was synchronizing with my heartbeat, or my heartbeat was synchronizing with it. Dr. Yates checked his tablet. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it. The clinical detachment was gone completely now. What remained was raw, primal fear, pressure sensors, hull breach. Something just penetrated the outer wall. We pulled up the external cameras, the ones showing the ocean outside the station. The water was full of lights, not bioluminescence. These were too bright, too steady, too organized. They formed patterns in the dark, circles, spirals, geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, that made my eyes water and my brain ache. Mathematics made visible, geometry that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space, and they were moving closer. The lights in the water formed a new pattern, a shape I recognized from somewhere deep in my subconscious, from dreams I hadn't had yet, from memories that weren't mine. The shape that Specimen 7H made people dream about, the city at the bottom of the ocean, and it was here, rising from depths our cameras couldn't reach, coming to the station with purpose and intelligence. Dr. Yates's whisper was barely audible. This isn't a breach. This is a summons. This is what happens every 17 days. Specimen A calls to them, to all of them, to the things in the chambers, to the things outside in the deep, to the city that's been waiting down here since before humans existed. It's been calling them for 36 years, and now they're finally answering. On the monitors, I watched the lights in the water grow brighter, watched shapes emerge from the darkness beyond our camera's range, shapes that defied description, that violated the rules of biology and physics and sanity. Things that were too large to exist at this depth, that moved in ways that ignored hydrodynamics, that radiated intelligence of a kind I couldn't begin to understand. In Section 7, the 5 trapped people had stopped running. They were all standing still now, faces turned toward the exterior walls, toward the water, toward those lights. Their expressions had changed. The terror was gone. They were smiling. All of them were smiling the same smile, the same too wide expression that split faces past normal limits. Dr. Lisa Chen pressed her palm against a porthole. On the other side, something pressed back. Something with too many fingers. Something that left a handprint on the glass that glowed with bioluminescence. The same 7-fingered handprint I'd seen in Chamber 7M. The same handprint that had appeared after the previous researcher disappeared. Understanding hit me like cold water. It's not a breach. It never was. They wanted to get out. The specimens. They've been planning this, coordinating this, waiting for the right moment. We just gave them an excuse. Dr. Yates nodded slowly, his face grey. The specimens aren't prisoners. They're seeds. We thought we were containing them, studying them, keeping them locked away from the surface world. But we've been growing them down here in the dark, feeding them, nurturing them, and now they're ready to bloom. The lights in the water began to pulse, all of them, in perfect synchronization, the same rhythm as Specimen A's 17-day cycle, the same pattern that had been calling to the deep for 36 years. The station shuddered, not from water pressure or mechanical failure. This was something else, something that resonated through the structure at a frequency I felt in my bones. Somewhere in the sealed Section 7, something began to sing. It wasn't Specimen C's song. This was older, deeper, the kind of sound that existed before ears evolved to hear it, before brains developed the capacity to process it. Primordial, ancient, wrong in ways that transcended language. And everyone in the monitoring room felt the urge to answer it, to go to the water, to join whatever was building that city in the dark, to become part of something vast and terrible and beautiful. Dr. Park moved toward the door, walking with smooth, deliberate steps. His eyes were unfocused. His expression was peaceful. Dr. Reese followed. Then Dr. Webb, his humming shifting to harmonize with the song from Section 7. I grabbed the desk to anchor myself, fighting the urge to follow them, fighting the certainty that the water was where I belonged, where we all belonged, where we'd always been meant to go. The song promised peace, promised understanding, promised an end to fear and confusion and the terrible isolation of individual consciousness, promised unity with something greater than myself, promised home. Dr. Yates grabbed my shoulder. His grip was painfully tight, nails digging into my skin through my shirt. The pain helped, gave me something to focus on besides the song. His face was close to mine, and I could see he was fighting the same battle, fighting the urge to let go, to surrender, to walk into the water and never come back. But he was losing. We were all losing. On the monitors, the 5 people in Section 7 were walking toward the portholes, moving in perfect synchronization, pressing their faces against the glass. The things on the other side were waiting for them, reaching toward them with appendages that defied description. The bulkhead door began to open, not from our side, from inside Section 7. Something was overriding the controls, something that understood our technology better than we did, that could interface with our systems in ways we'd never anticipated. Alex tried to stop it, fingers flying across the terminal, entering override codes, attempting to regain control. But the door continued to open. 3 feet, 5 feet, 10 feet, wide enough for something to slip through, wide enough for the darkness to spread, wide enough for whatever was singing that ancient song to enter the rest of the station. Alex stood and backed away from the terminal. Their surgical mask had fallen off, revealing their face. It was covered in mouths. Dozens of them, different sizes, all of them moving, all of them singing in harmony with the song from Section 7. Alex had been compromised. For how long I didn't know. Days, weeks, since before I arrived. The bulkhead door continued to open. I watched the monitors and saw our deaths approaching in high definition, saw the specimens escaping their chambers, saw the things in the water pressing against the hull with strength that would eventually crack steel, saw the station beginning to fail under pressure that wasn't physical, but something worse. We needed to surface, needed to evacuate, needed to get as far from this place as possible before everything fell apart. But Dr. Yates was laughing. The sound was horrible, broken and desperate and resigned, full of knowledge I didn't want to possess. The submarine only comes if we call it, and the communication system runs through Section 7, the section we'd just sealed, the section that was now opening, the section where darkness and impossible geometry and things that sang reality-breaking songs were waiting to spread through the rest of the station. We had no way to call for help, no way to escape, no way to stop what was happening. The things we'd been keeping contained for decades were finally free, and they were coming for us. The lights in the monitoring room flickered, once, twice. When they came back on, there was something standing in the corner where Alex had been. It looked like Alex. Same uniform, same height, same general build, but it was wrong. Its proportions shifted as I watched, like it couldn't quite decide what human looked like, couldn't quite remember the right number of joints in each limb, arms that were slightly too long, shoulders that didn't quite align, head tilted at an angle that should have broken the neck. It turned to face us, and I saw that its bandaged hands were unwrapping themselves. The bandages fell away in strips, revealing what was underneath. Not hands, never hands. Clusters of fingers extending from wrists in arrangements that violated bilateral symmetry. Some fingers were too long. Some were too short. Some bent in directions fingers don't bend. All of them were moving independently, flexing and curling with insect-like coordination. The thing that looked like Alex smiled with a mouth that had too many teeth, arranged in too many rows. Teeth that went back too far into a throat that extended deeper than a human throat should. Then it started walking toward us. And behind it, through the open door, I could see the darkness from 7F spreading into the corridor like spilled ink, coming closer, coming for us. Dr. Yates grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the emergency exit. His grip was iron. His eyes were wide with the kind of fear that comes from understanding exactly what's hunting you. We ran. Behind us, the thing that wasn't Alex began to sing. And in the deep water outside, hundreds of voices answered. The song filled the station, filled my head, filled the spaces between my thoughts, promising peace in the deep, unity in the dark, home in the city that was rising from the abyss. I ran and tried not to listen, tried not to believe, tried not to want what it was offering. But the song was beautiful, and I was so tired of being afraid. We ran through corridors that twisted in ways they shouldn't. I'd studied the station's schematics enough times to know the layout by heart, but nothing matched anymore. Hallways extended too far. Turns appeared where there should have been straight passages. Doors that had been on the left were now on the right, or missing entirely, replaced by blank walls that wept condensation in patterns that looked like screaming faces. Dr. Yates moved with surprising speed for his age, pulling me along by the wrist when I hesitated. Behind us, the song continued. The thing that had been Alex was singing in harmony with Specimen C, and underneath both voices I could hear something deeper, something rising from the water outside, something that had been waiting in the abyss for 36 years, called by Specimen A's 17-day pulse, finally answering. The station shuddered again, not from water pressure. This was something else entirely. A resonance that made my bones vibrate and my teeth ache. The lights flickered, and in the moments of darkness, I saw things moving in the corridors ahead. Shapes that didn't resolve into anything recognizable when the lights returned. Dr. Yates yanked me through a door I didn't remember passing before. We emerged into a section of the station I'd never seen. The walls here were different, older, somehow. Covered in a patina that suggested decades of use despite the station being operational for less than a year. The metal was scored with marks that looked deliberate, symbols, warnings, messages scratched by fingernails or something sharper. Don't let them in. Too late. Too late. Too late. They were always here. The corridor sloped upward at a steep angle. Dr. Yates didn't slow down, just kept climbing with mechanical determination. His breathing was labored now, ragged, but he didn't stop, didn't look back. I made the mistake of looking back. The darkness from chamber 7F was following us. Not quickly. It didn't need speed. It flowed up the corridor like rising water, climbing the walls, spreading across the ceiling. And in that darkness, I could see shapes, human shapes, moving with that same too fluid motion I'd seen in the possessed maintenance worker. How many people had it consumed? How many hosts was it wearing now? The answer came as we turned a corner. Through a porthole to our left, I saw Section 7. Saw the corridors we'd sealed off. They were full of people, all the researchers and maintenance workers who'd been trapped when the bulkhead closed. All of them were walking in the same direction, moving in perfect synchronization toward the exterior portholes. And beyond the glass, the things in the water were waiting. I saw Dr. Lisa Chen press her palm against a porthole, saw the 7-fingered thing on the other side match her gesture, saw the glass begin to crack, hairline fractures spreading from where their hands met, growing, branching, creating patterns that looked almost like circuitry, like the glass itself was being reprogrammed at a molecular level. The porthole shattered, water rushed in, not violently, almost gently, like it was being invited, like the station was opening itself to the ocean, welcoming it inside. Dr. Lisa Chen didn't move as the water engulfed her, just stood there, smiling, as the pressure and cold should have killed her instantly. But she didn't die, didn't even seem uncomfortable, just stood in the rushing water as something came through the broken porthole, something that had too many limbs and moved in directions that hurt to perceive. It touched her face with appendages that looked almost like fingers. She leaned into the touch like a cat seeking affection. Then she turned and walked deeper into Section 7, into the flooded corridors, and disappeared from view. The thing followed her, or led her. It was impossible to tell which. Dr. Yates pulled me away from the porthole before I could see more. His face was grey, sweat ran down his temples despite the cold. His hands were shaking badly now, the clinical detachment completely shattered. We kept climbing. The slope grew steeper. My legs burned. My lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. But the song behind us was getting closer, and that was enough to keep me moving. Enough to override the pain and exhaustion, an overwhelming urge to just stop, to turn around, to let the darkness catch up and make everything peaceful and quiet. We passed more doors. Most were sealed, welded shut. Some had warning signs I recognized from hazardous material protocols. Others had symbols I didn't recognize at all, ancient-looking marks that predated modern safety signage, warnings that transcended language. One door was open, just slightly, a few inches, enough to see into the room beyond. I caught a glimpse of monitors, dozens of them, just like in my observation room. But these screens showed different things, not the specimens in their chambers. These showed the ocean outside, showed the lights in the water, showed things moving in the abyss that were too large to be real. And on one screen, I saw the surface, saw sunlight, saw waves and clouds, and a world where things made sense. Saw a submarine docked at a surface vessel, saw people disembarking, recognized the technician from my descent, the one who'd been down here for 5 months and 23 days. The timestamp on the footage read 3 hours ago. He'd made it, had survived his contract, had been extracted. The screen flickered, changed, showed the interior of the submarine, showed the technician sitting in the same seat I'd occupied during my descent, showed him staring at nothing with empty eyes, showed his mouth opening, wider than mouths should open, showed something crawling out from between his teeth, something small and segmented that skittered across the submarine's floor toward the pilot. The pilot didn't react, just kept his hands on the controls, eyes straight ahead, like he couldn't see it, like he'd learned not to see things that shouldn't exist, or like he'd already been infected weeks ago, and was long past the point of reaction. The screen went black. Dr. Yates dragged me past the open door before I could see more. But I understood now. Understood why the submarine only came if they called it. Why extraction wasn't guaranteed. Because leaving didn't mean escape. The specimens got out eventually, one way or another, in hosts, in minds, in dreams and songs and promises. They were patient, had been patient for decades, for centuries, for however long they'd been down here in the dark. A few more miles of ocean weren't going to stop them. We emerged into a section I recognized from my first day, the residential area, the corridor where I'd seen people standing in corners, facing walls, where I'd heard wet sounds behind closed doors. The doors were all open now, the rooms were empty, everyone was gone, every researcher, every technician, every person who'd been living in these tiny cells. All of them had left, walked out, gone somewhere, gone to the water. My cabin door stood open. I glanced inside as we passed. Someone had been in there, recently. My belongings were scattered. The mattress was torn open, plastic wrapping shredded. The window shade was up, and beyond the glass, something was looking in. It was massive. I could only see a portion of it through the small porthole. What might have been an eye, or a sensory organ, or something I had no reference for. It pulsed with bioluminescence, creating patterns that looked almost like communication, like language made of light. The eye tracked our movement as we ran past, followed us with intelligent focus. It knew we were here, knew we were running, knew there was nowhere to run to. The station shuddered again, more violently this time. The metal groaned, not the normal sounds of pressure and stress. This sounded organic, like the station itself was alive, like it was breathing, transforming, becoming something other than what it had been designed to be. Dr. Yates pulled me through another door. We were in a stairwell now, actual stairs, not a sloped corridor. Going up. The steps were steep and narrow, designed for emergency evacuation, designed to reach the upper levels of the station, the levels closer to the surface, closer to escape. We climbed. Dr. Yates was slowing down now. His breathing had become wheezing. His grip on my wrist was weakening. But he didn't stop, just kept climbing with determination born of desperation. I could still hear the song behind us, fainter now, but not gone, never gone. It echoed through the stairwell, bouncing off metal walls, creating harmonics that shouldn't exist, creating melodies that promised peace and rest and an end to running. We passed a landing. The door here was marked Level 2. I'd been on Level 3 since arriving, hadn't known there were levels above. The schematics had only shown the lower sections, but there were more levels, more spaces, more secrets. How much of this station had been hidden from me? How much was still hidden? We kept climbing. Level 1. The door here was different, heavier, reinforced, with biometric locks and warning signs that suggested this was a restricted area. Dr. Yates didn't even pause, just placed his palm on the scanner. The door unlocked immediately. Beyond was a corridor that looked nothing like the rest of the station. This wasn't industrial, wasn't utilitarian. This section looked almost comfortable, normal, like offices or living quarters designed for long-term habitation. Like someone lived up here, had been living up here while the rest of us suffered in the lower levels. We passed doors marked Director, Administration, Communications, Communications. Dr. Yates had said the communication system ran through Section 7, that we couldn't call for the submarine because Section 7 was sealed. He'd lied. The communications room was right here, intact, accessible, with equipment that looked functional and ready. I pulled my wrist free from his grip and stopped. He turned back, face desperate, pleading. But I didn't move. I asked why he'd lied, why he'd told me we couldn't call for extraction when the communications equipment was right here. For the first time since I'd met him, Dr. Yates looked ashamed. The clinical detachment was completely gone now. What remained was just an old man who'd made terrible choices and lived with the consequences for far too long. He told me the truth. They couldn't call the submarine. Not because the equipment was damaged, because it had been forbidden, because what was happening down here, the specimens escaping, the station failing, the things in the water answering Specimen A's call, all of it was expected, planned for, part of the research. The station wasn't just a containment facility. It was an experiment, a test to see what would happen when the specimens were kept together, when they were allowed to interact through proximity, when they were given enough time to coordinate, when they were given hosts. Everyone down here was expendable, test subjects, variables in an experiment designed by people who watched from a safe distance, people who wanted to understand how the specimens spread, how they infected, how they transformed. People who were willing to sacrifice everyone on this station to gather that data. I asked where those people were, who was running this experiment. Dr. Yates didn't answer, just looked at the ceiling, at the levels above us that I hadn't known existed. They were here, in the station, had been here the entire time, watching from above while we suffered below, recording everything, learning from our deaths, waiting to see how long we'd survive, waiting to see how we'd change. I moved toward the communications room. If he wouldn't call for extraction, I would send a distress signal, would contact someone, anyone who might send help. Dr. Yates grabbed my arm, not roughly, almost gently. His voice was soft, resigned. He explained it wouldn't matter. The submarine was already compromised. The pilot was infected. The technician who'd been extracted was carrying something inside him. They'd be at the surface vessel by now, would be spreading to the crew, to the support staff, to everyone. Calling the submarine back would just bring more hosts to the station, more people for the specimens to consume, more vectors for spreading to the surface. The best thing we could do was stay here, seal ourselves in, hope the specimens were satisfied with what they already had. Hope they didn't come looking for us. I asked about the levels above, about the people watching. Could we reach them? Could we get to whatever escape method they had? Dr. Yates' laugh was bitter, broken. There was no escape method. The people above were just as trapped as we were. They'd built their observation deck, thinking they'd be safe, thinking the specimens couldn't reach that high, thinking steel and distance would protect them. They'd been wrong. The specimens had reached level 1 3 days ago, had found the people watching, had shown them what happened to observers who watched too long. The researchers above were dead, or transformed, or somewhere in between. We were alone up here, alone in a station that was becoming something else. Something that existed partially in our dimension and partially in spaces we couldn't perceive, transforming under the influence of specimens that rewrote the rules of reality just by existing. The song grew louder, not behind us anymore, coming from above, coming from level 1. The specimens had followed us up, or had been waiting here all along. It was impossible to tell which. The lights went out. In the darkness, I heard movement, footsteps that came from multiple directions at once, breathing that sounded wrong, too many lungs, too many mouths, rhythms that didn't sync. Dr. Yates' hand found mine in the dark, squeezed once, an apology, a farewell. Then his hand was gone, and I was alone in the darkness. The emergency lights came on, dim red, barely enough to see. Dr. Yates was standing 5 feet away. But something was wrong with him. His proportions had changed. Shoulders at the wrong angle, arms too long, head tilted in a way that should have broken his neck. He smiled at me. The expression was all wrong. Too wide, too many teeth. He spoke, but the voice wasn't his. It was multiple voices. The possessed maintenance worker, Dr. Lisa Chen, Alex Crowley, all the people who'd been consumed, all speaking through Dr. Yates' mouth in terrible harmony. They thanked me for coming down here, for being part of the experiment, for contributing my observations and my fear and my desperate hope, for feeding them. They explained that the specimens weren't imprisoned here, had never been imprisoned. The chambers weren't cages, they were incubators, places to grow and develop until they were ready to spread, ready to transform, ready to make the surface world understand what lived in the deep places. Dr. Yates took a step toward me, then another, moving with that fluid, wrong motion. I ran, found a door, any door, burst through it without looking, found myself in a room full of monitors, just like my observation room, just like the room I'd glimpsed earlier. But these screens showed different things now. They showed the surface, showed the support vessel, showed crew members with black eyes and 2 wide smiles, showed them returning to port, disembarking, walking into a coastal town, walking into crowds, touching people, spreading. Other screens showed different locations, research stations, military bases, government facilities, all of them receiving specimens, all of them conducting the same experiments, all of them thinking they were containing something dangerous, all of them incubating. We weren't an isolated station. We were one node in a network, one test site among many. And in every location, the same thing was happening. The specimens were escaping, were spreading, were transforming their hosts and reaching for the surface, reaching for humanity. The timeline on one screen showed dates, projections, mathematical models, surface contact, 3 days, initial spread, 2 weeks, critical saturation, 6 months, total integration, 18 months. 18 months until humanity was transformed into something else, something that lived in the deep places, something that sang reality-breaking songs and existed in dimensions we couldn't perceive, something that wasn't human anymore, but remembered being human, remembered it the way Specimen C remembered being a little girl, the way the thing that had been Dr. Yates remembered being a scientist. The door behind me opened. I turned. The thing that had been Dr. Yates stood in the doorway. Behind it, I could see others. The possessed maintenance worker, Alex Crowley, face covered in singing mouths. Dr. Webb, still humming that 4-note melody. Dr. Reese, hair falling out in clumps, eyes tracking in different directions. All of them were smiling. All of them were reaching for me. I looked around the room desperately, searching for another exit, another way out, finding nothing but walls and monitors and the truth they displayed. Then I saw it, in the corner, a small door marked Emergency Ascent Pod, the same emergency system mentioned in my orientation materials. Individual escape pods for critical personnel, designed to reach the surface in case of catastrophic failure. I ran for it. The transformed researchers moved to intercept, but they were still learning how to coordinate their stolen bodies, still figuring out which muscles to use, which joints to bend. I reached the door first, slammed my palm against the scanner. Access denied. I tried again. Same result. The system didn't recognize me as authorized personnel, didn't recognize me as someone worth saving. Behind me, the transformed researchers were getting closer, learning how to move faster, how to corner prey. I hit the scanner again. Again. Desperation making me stupid, making me repeat the same action expecting different results. The thing that had been Dr. Yates reached out with two long arms, touched my shoulder with fingers that bent in too many places. The door opened. I didn't question why, didn't stop to wonder what had changed. Just threw myself through the opening and slammed the emergency close button. The door sealed with a heavy clunk. Through the small window, I could see the transformed researchers pressing against the glass, mouths opening, singing, promising peace if I'd just opened the door, promising unity, promising an end to loneliness, promising home. I turned away and found myself in a small chamber, barely larger than a closet, dominated by a pod that looked like a miniature submarine, sleek, compact, designed for one person. A screen next to the pod displayed instructions. Simple, clear. Enter pod, seal hatch, press green button. Ascent will begin automatically. I climbed into the pod. The interior was cramped but functional. A single seat, a small control panel, a porthole showing the chamber outside. Through that porthole, I could see the door, could see faces pressed against the glass, could see mouths moving in song I could no longer hear through the pod's insulation. I sealed the hatch, the pod pressurized with a hiss, then silence. Complete silence. The sound insulation was perfect. I couldn't hear the song anymore, couldn't hear the promises and lies and terrible truths. For the first time since arriving at Station Nereus, I was alone with my own thoughts. I pressed the green button. The pod lurched. Mechanical sounds, clamps releasing, systems engaging. Then movement, upward movement. The pod was ascending through a vertical shaft I hadn't known existed, rising toward the surface, rising toward escape. I watched through the porthole as the chamber fell away below me, watched the station recede into darkness, watched the lights in the water grow distant. The ascent was slow, steady. The pod climbed through 3 miles of ocean at a measured pace, equalizing pressure gradually to prevent the bends, to keep me alive. I should have felt relief, should have felt hope. I was escaping, surviving, reaching the surface, but all I felt was dread, because I'd seen the monitors, seen the timeline, seen the projections showing what would happen in the next 18 months. And I'd felt something when the thing that had been Dr. Yates touched me, something that crawled under my skin, something that burrowed into my thoughts, something that was still there. I looked at my reflection in the pod's metallic surface, studied my face, my eyes. They looked normal, brown, human, the same eyes I'd always had. But in certain light, at certain angles, they looked darker, deeper, like voids, like doorways. My hand moved to my throat, felt the skin there, felt something under the surface, something moving, adjusting, learning the geography of my body, learning how to be me. The pod continued its ascent. The depth gauge showed 10,000 feet, then 8,000, then 5,000. Getting closer to the surface, closer to the world above, closer to humanity. I thought about the support vessel, about the crew who would pull me from the pod, who would welcome me back. who would debrief me about what happened, who would touch me, who would give it new hosts. I reached for the controls, found the manual override, the system that would let me stop the ascent, let me sink back down to the depths, let me stay in the dark where I belonged now. My hand hovered over the button, 2,000 feet. The water outside the porthole was getting lighter. I could see traces of sunlight filtering down from above, the first natural light I'd seen in days. It hurt to look at. I pressed the button. Nothing happened. The ascent continued. The manual override didn't work, or had been disabled, or was never real in the first place. The pod was designed for one purpose: to reach the surface, to deliver its occupant to the world above, to spread the infection 1,000 feet. I could see the surface now, see waves, see the hull of a ship waiting above, see my future spreading out before me like a disease vector, like a timeline of transformation, like the end of humanity wrapped in the skin of a survivor. 500 feet. I sang, couldn't help it, couldn't stop it. The song came out of my throat in a voice that was mine and not mine. 4 notes in a pattern that made my teeth ache, that made the pod's metal resonate in harmony. That called to the deep, 200 feet. Through the porthole, I saw something massive moving below, rising with the pod, following me up, making sure I reached the surface, making sure the infection spread, making sure I didn't change my mind. 100 feet. I saw faces in the water. Dr. Lisa Chen, the maintenance worker. Others I didn't recognize. All of them were swimming upward with me. All of them were smiling. All of them were going home. 50 feet. The pod broke the surface. Sunlight flooded through the porthole. Warm, bright, beautiful. I screamed. The light burned. Not my eyes. Those had already changed, had already adapted to the deep. The light burned something deeper, burned away the last traces of who I'd been, burned away the person who'd descended into the abyss thinking she could survive it unchanged, burned away Sarah Chen and left something else in her place. The hatch opened from the outside. Hands reached in, human hands, warm, concerned, trying to help. I took them. Let them pull me out into the sunlight and fresh air. Let them wrap me in blankets. Let them ask questions I answered with the right words and the right tone and the right amount of trauma. Let them believe I was a survivor. Let them believe I was still human. I looked back at the water, saw shapes moving below the surface, saw the others who'd come up with me, waiting just out of sight, waiting for dark, waiting for the right moment, waiting for me to spread the song. The support vessel's captain asked if I was okay, asked what happened down there, asked why I was the only one to make it out. I smiled. The expression felt wrong on my face, too wide, like I was wearing skin that didn't quite fit. I told him everyone else was dead, told him there'd been an accident, containment failure, nothing they could have prevented. I told him the specimens were still contained, still locked away in the deep where they couldn't hurt anyone. I lied, and somewhere in the water below, something that used to be Dr. Yates smiled with too many teeth and began its own ascent. The infection had reached the surface, and I was patient 0. I had 18 months. 18 months to watch humanity transform, to watch the song spread from person to person, to watch the world learn what lived in the deep places, to watch us all go home. I stood on the deck of the support vessel and looked at the ocean stretching to the horizon, looked at the sun setting in the west, painting the water red and gold, looked at the future and saw it looking back at me with void black eyes. In my pocket, my phone buzzed, service restored, messages downloading. My father's nurse asking about my first week, asking when I'd visit, asking when I'd come home. Soon, I typed back. Very soon. I hit send and felt something move under my skin. Felt it settle into place. Felt it become part of me. Felt myself become part of it. The sun sank below the horizon, and in the gathering dark, I began to sing. 4 notes. The same melody I'd heard in the station corridors. The same song that had been calling from the deep for 36 years. And all across the support vessel, people stopped what they were doing and turned to listen. Started humming along, started smiling, started understanding where they belonged. We sailed toward port as the stars came out above and the lights came on below. Sailed towards cities full of people who didn't know they were already infected, who didn't know the song was spreading through networks and phone calls, and every interaction with returned researchers from deep-sea stations around the world, who didn't know that in 18 months, humanity would understand what it meant to live in the deep places, what it meant to be home. I stood at the railing and watched the waves and waited for the transformation to complete, waited to forget what it felt like to be human, waited to remember what I'd always been, sang with me, welcoming me home.